The Gallic Wars by Julius Caesar, translated by W.A. McDivitt and W.S. Bond. Book 7. Chapter 1. Gaul being tranquil, Caesar, as he had determined, sets out for Italy to hold the provincial assizes. There he receives intelligence of the death of Claudius, and, being informed of the decree of the Senate, to the effect that all the youth of Italy should take the military oath, he determined to hold a levy throughout the entire province. Report of these events is rapidly borne into Transalpine Gaul. The Gauls themselves add to the report and invent what the case seemed to require, namely, that Caesar was detained by commotions in the city and could not, amid so violent dissensions, come to his army. Animated by this opportunity, they who already, previously to this occurrence, were indignant that they were reduced beneath the dominion of Rome, begin to organize their plans for war more openly and daringly. The leading men of Gaul, having convened councils among themselves in the woods and retired places, complain of the death of Acco. They point out that this fate may fall in turn on themselves. They bewail the unhappy fate of Gaul, and by every sort of promise and rewards, they earnestly solicit some to begin the war, and assert the freedom of Gaul at the hazard of their lives. They say that special care should be paid to this, that Caesar should be cut off from his army, before their secret plans should be divulged. That this was easy, because neither would the legions, in the absence of their general, dare to leave their winter quarters, nor could the general reach his army without a guard. Finally, that it was better to be slain in battle than not to recover their ancient glory in war, and that freedom which they had received from their forefathers. Chapter 2. While these things are in agitation, the Carnutes declare that they would decline no danger for the sake of the general safety, and promise that they would be the first of all to begin the war. And since they cannot at present take precautions, by giving and receiving hostages, that the affair shall not be divulged, they require that a solemn assurance be given them by oath and plighted honor, their military standards being brought together, in which manner their most sacred obligations are made binding, that they should not be deserted by the rest of the Gauls on commencing the war. Chapter 3. When the appointed day came, the Carnutes, under the command of Cottuatus and Conatodunus, desperate men, meet together at Genabum and slay the Roman citizens who had settled there for the purpose of trading, among the rest Caius Fucius Cutsita, a distinguished Roman knight, who by Caesar's orders had presided over the provision department and plundered their property. The report is quickly spread among all the states of Gaul, for whenever a more important and remarkable event takes place, they transmit the intelligence through their lands and districts by a shout. The others take it up in succession and pass it to their neighbors, as happened on this occasion, for the things which were done at Genabum at sunrise were heard in the territories of the Arverni before the end of the first watch, which is an extent of more than 160 miles. Chapter 4. There, in like manner, Vercingetorix, the son of Celtillus, the Avernian, a young man of the highest power, whose father had held the supremacy of entire Gaul, and had been put to death by his fellow citizens, for this reason, because he aimed at sovereign power, summoned together his dependents, and easily excited them. On his design being made known, they rushed to arms. He is expelled from the town of Gergovia by his uncle Gobanitio, and the rest of the nobles, who were of opinion that such an enterprise ought not to be hazarded. He did not, however, desist, but held in the country a levy of the needy and desperate. Having collected such a body of troops, he brings over to his sentiments such of his fellow citizens as he has access to. He exhorts them to take up arms in behalf of the general freedom, and having assembled great forces, he drives from the state his opponents, by whom he had been expelled a short time previously. He is saluted king by his partisans. He sends ambassadors in every direction. He conjures them to adhere firmly to their promise. He quickly attaches to his interests the Senones, Parisi, Pictones, Caroci, Torones, Alarsi, Lemovice, and all the others who border on the ocean. The supreme command is conferred on him by unanimous consent. On obtaining this authority, he demands hostages from all these states. He orders a fixed number of soldiers to be sent to him immediately. He determines what quantity of arms each state shall prepare at war, and before what time. He pays particular attention to the cavalry. To the utmost vigilance he adds the utmost rigor of authority, and by the severity of his punishments brings over the wavering. For on the commission of a greater crime, he puts the perpetrators to death by fire and every sort of tortures. For a slighter cause, he sends home the offenders with their ears cut off, or one of their eyes put out, that they may be an example to the rest, and frighten others by the severity of their punishment. Chapter 5. Having quickly collected an army by their punishments, he sends Luctarius, one of the Cadorci, a man the utmost daring, with part of his forces, into the territory of the Ruteni, and marches in person into the country of the Bituriges. On his arrival, the Bituriges send ambassadors to Audoi, under whose protection they were, to solicit aid in order that they might more easily resist the forces of the enemy. The Audoi, by the advice of the lieutenants, whom Caesar had left with the army, send supplies of horse and foot to succor the Bituriges. When they came to the river Lori, which separates the Bituriges from the Audoi, they delayed a few days there, and, not daring to pass the river, return home, and send back word to the lieutenants that they had returned through fear of the treachery of the Bituriges, who, they ascertained, had formed this design, that if the Audoi should cross the river, the Bituriges on the one side, and the Arverni on the other, should surround them. Whether they did this for the reason which they alleged to the lieutenants, or influenced by treachery, we think that we ought not to state as certain, because we have no proof. On their departure, the Bituriges immediately unite themselves to the Arverni. Chapter 6. These affairs being announced to Caesar in Italy, at the time when he understood that matters in the city had been reduced to a more tranquil state by the energy of Cneius Pompey, he set out for Transalpine Gaul. After he had arrived there, he was greatly at a loss to know by what means he could reach his army. For if he should summon the legions into the province, he was aware that on their march they would have to fight in his absence. He foresaw, too, that if he himself should endeavor to reach the army, he would act injudiciously, entrusting his safety even to those who seemed to be tranquilized. Chapter 7. In the meantime, Luctarius, the Cadorcan, having been sent into the country of the Ruteni, gains over that state to the Arverni. Having advanced into the country of the Nitobriges and Gabali, he receives hostages from both nations, and, assembling a numerous force, marches to make a descent on the province in the direction of Narbo. Caesar, when this circumstance was announced to him, thought that the march to Narbo ought to take the precedence of all his other plans. When he arrived there, he encourages the timid and stations garrisons among the Ruteni in the province of the Volcae, Aracorne, and the country around Narbo, which was in the vicinity of the enemy. He orders a portion of the forces from the province, and the recruits which he had brought from Italy, to rendezvous among the Helvi, who border on the territories of the Avarni. Chapter 8. These matters being arranged, and Luctarius, now checked and forced to retreat, because he thought it dangerous to enter the line of Roman garrisons. Caesar marches into the country of the Helvii, although Mount Cevennes, which separates the Arverni from the Helvii, blocked up the way with very deep snow, as it was the severe season of the year. Yet having cleared away the snow to the depth of 6 feet, and having opened the roads, he reaches the territories of the Arverni with infinite labor to his soldiers. This being surprised, because they considered themselves defended by the Cevennes as by a wall, and the paths at this season of the year had never before been passable, even to individuals, he orders the cavalry to extend themselves as far as they could, and strike as great a panic as possible into the enemy. These proceedings are speedily announced to Vercingetorix by rumor and his messengers. Around him all the Arverni crowd in alarm, and solemnly entreat him to protect their property, and not to suffer them to be plundered by the enemy, especially as he saw that all the war was transferred into their country. In being prevailed upon by their entreaties, he moves his camp from the country of the Bituriges in the direction of the Arverni. Chapter 9. Caesar, having delayed 2 days in that place, because he had anticipated that, in the natural course of events, such would be the conduct of Vercingetorix, leaves the army under pretense of raising recruits and cavalry. He places Brutus, a young man, in command of these forces. He gives him instructions that the cavalry should range as extensively as possible in all directions, that he would exert himself not to be absent from the camp longer than 3 days. Having arranged these matters, he marches to Vienna by as long journeys as he can, when his own soldiers did not expect him. Finding there a fresh body of cavalry, which he had sent on to that place several days before, marching incessantly night and day, he advanced rapidly through the territory of the Aedui into that of the Lingones, in which 2 legions were wintering, that, if any plan affecting his own safety should have been organized by the Aedui, he might defeat it by the rapidity of his movements. When he arrived there, he sends information to the rest of the legions, and gathers all his army into one place before intelligence of his arrival could be announced to the Arverni. Vercingetorix, on hearing this circumstance, leads back his army into the country of the Bituriges, and after marching from it to Gergova, a town of the Boii, whom Caesar had settled there after defeating them in the Helvetian War, and had rendered tributary to the Aedui, he determined to attack it. Chapter 10. This action caused great perplexity to Caesar in the selection of his plans. He feared lest, if he should confine his legions in one place for the remaining portion of the winter, all Gaul should revolt when the tributaries of the Aedui were subdued, because it would appear that there was in him no protection for his friends. But if he should draw them too soon out of their winter quarters, he might be distressed by the want of provisions, in consequence of the difficulty of conveyance. It seemed better, however, to endure every hardship than to alienate the affections of all his allies by submitting to such an insult, having, therefore, impressed on the Aedui the necessity of supplying him with provisions. He sends forward messengers to the Boii to inform them of his arrival, and encourage them to remain firm in their allegiance and resist the attack of the enemy with great resolution. Having left 2 legions and the luggage of the entire army at Agendicum, he marches to the Boii. Chapter 11. On the 2nd day, when he came to Velundunum, a town of the Senones, he determined to attack it, in order that he might not leave an enemy in his rear, and might the more easily procure supplies of provisions, and draw a line of circumvallation around it in 2 days. On the 3rd day, ambassadors being sent from the town to treat of a capitulation, he orders their arms to be brought together, their cattle to be brought forth, and 600 hostages to be given. He leaves Caius Trebonius, his lieutenant, to complete these arrangements. He himself sets out with the intention of marching as soon as possible to Genabum, a town of the Carnutes, who, having then for the first time received information of the siege of Volunodunum, as they thought that it would be protracted to a longer time, were preparing a garrison to send to Genabum for the defense of that town. Caesar arrived there in 2 days, after pitching his camp before the town. Being prevented by the time of the day, he defers the attack to the next day, and orders his soldiers to prepare whatever was necessary for that enterprise. And as a bridge over the Loire connected the town of Genabum with the opposite bank, fearing lest the inhabitants should escape by night from the town, he orders 2 legions to keep watch under arms. The people of Genabum came forth silently from the city before midnight, and began to cross the river. When this circumstance was announced by scouts, Caesar, having set fire to the gates, sends in the legions which he had ordered to be ready, and obtains possession of the town so completely that very few of the whole number of the enemy escaped being taken alive, because the narrowness of the bridges and the roads prevented the multitude from escaping. He pillages and burns the town, gives the booty to the soldiers, then leads his army over the Loire, and marches into the territories of the Bituriges. Chapter 12. Vercingetorix, when he ascertained the arrival of Caesar, desisted from the siege of Gergovia, and marched to meet Caesar. The latter had commenced to besiege Noviodunum, and when ambassadors came from this town to beg that he would pardon them, and spare their lives, in order that he might execute the rest of his designs, with the rapidity by which he had accomplished most of them. He orders their arms to be collected, their horses to be brought forth, and hostages to be given. A part of the hostages being now delivered up, when the rest of the terms were being performed, a few centurions and soldiers being sent into the town to collect the arms and horses. The enemy's cavalry, which had outstripped the main body of Vercingetorix's army, was seen at a distance, as soon as the townsmen beheld them, and entertained hopes of assistance. Raising a shout, they began to take up arms, shut the gates, and line the walls. When the centurions in the town understood from the signal-making of the Gauls that they were forming some new design, they drew their swords and seized the gates, and recovered all their men safe. Chapter 13. Caesar orders the horse to be drawn out of the camp, and commences a cavalry action, his men being now distressed. Caesar sends to their aid about 400 German horse, which he had determined, at the beginning, to keep with himself. The Gauls could not withstand their attack, but were put to flight, and retreated to their main body. After losing a great number of men, when they were routed, the townsmen, again intimidated, arrested those persons by whose exertions they thought that the mob had been roused, and brought them to Caesar, and surrendered themselves to him. When these affairs were accomplished, Caesar marched to the Avaricum, which was the largest and best fortified town in the territories of the Bituriges, and situated in a most fertile tract of country, because he confidently expected that on taking that town, he would reduce beneath his dominion the state of the Bituriges. Chapter 14. Vercingetorix, after sustaining such a series of losses at Volundunum, Genabum, and Noviodunum, summons his men to a council. He impresses on them that the war must be prosecuted on a very different system from that which had been previously adopted. But they should by all means aim at this object, that the Romans should be prevented from foraging and procuring provisions, that this was easy, because they themselves were well supplied with cavalry, and were likewise assisted by the season of the year, that foraging could not be cut, that the enemy must necessarily disperse, and look for it in the houses, that all these might be daily destroyed by the horse. Besides that the interests of private property must be neglected for the sake of the general safety, that the villages and houses ought to be fired over such an extent of country in every direction from Boea, as the Romans appeared capable of scouring in their search for forage, that an abundance of these necessaries could be supplied to them, because they would be assisted by the resources of those in whose territories the war would be waged, that the Romans either would not bear the privation, or else would advance to any distance from the camp with considerable danger, and that it made no difference whether they slew them or stripped them of their baggage, since, if it was lost, they could not carry on the war. Besides that, the towns ought to be burned, which were not secured against every danger by their fortifications or natural advantages, that there should not be places of retreat for their own countrymen for declining military service, nor be exposed to the Romans as inducements to carry off abundance of provisions and plunder. If these sacrifices should appear heavy or galling, that they ought to consider it much more distressing that their wives and children should be dragged off to slavery, and themselves slain, the evils which must necessarily befall the conquered. Chapter 15. This opinion having been approved of by unanimous consent, more than 20 towns of the Bituriges are burned in one day. Conflagrations are beheld in every quarter, and although all bore this with great regret, yet they laid before themselves this consolation, that, as the victory was certain, they could quickly recover their losses. There is a debate concerning avaricum in the General Council, whether they should decide that it should be burned or defended. The Bituriges threw themselves at the feet of all the Gauls, and entreat that they should not be compelled to set fire with their own hands to the fairest city of almost the whole of Gaul, which was both a protection and ornament to the state. They say that they could easily defend it, owing to the nature of the ground, for, being enclosed almost on every side by a river and a marsh, it had only one entrance, and that very narrow. Permission being granted to them at their earnest request, Vercingetorix at first dissuades them from it, but afterwards concedes the point, owing to their entreaties and the compassion of the soldiers. A proper garrison is selected for the town. Chapter 16. Vercingetorix follows closely upon Caesar by shorter marches, and selects for his camp a place defended by woods and marshes, at the distance of 15 miles from Avaricum. There he received intelligence by trusty scouts, every hour in the day, of what was going on at Avaricum, and ordered whatever he wished to be done. He closely watched all our expeditions for corn and forage, and whenever they were compelled to go to a greater distance, he attacked them when dispersed, and inflicted severe loss upon them, although the evil was remedied by our men, as far as precautions could be taken, by going forth at irregular times, and by different ways. Chapter 17. Caesar pitching his camp at that side of the town which was not defended by the river and marsh, and had a very narrow approach, as we have mentioned, began to raise the Venae and erect 2 towers, for the nature of the place prevented him from drawing a line of circumvallation. He never ceased to importune the boy and Audouai for supplies of corn, of whom the one, the Audouai, because they were acting with no zeal, did not aid him much. The others, the boy, as their resources were not great, quickly consumed what they had, although the army was distressed by the greatest want of corn, through the poverty of the boy, the apathy of the Audouai, and the burning of the houses, to such a degree that for several days the soldiers were without corn, and satisfied their extreme hunger with cattle driven from the remote villages. Yet no language was heard from them unworthy of the majesty of the Roman people and their former victories. Moreover, when Caesar addressed the legions, one by one, when at work, and said that he would raise the siege if they felt the scarcity too severely, they unanimously begged him not to do so, that they had served for several years under his command in such a manner that they never submitted to insult, and never abandoned an enterprise without accomplishing it, that they should consider it a disgrace if they abandoned the siege after commencing it, that it was better to endure every hardship than to not avenge the names of the Roman citizens who perished at Cannabum by the perfidy of the Gauls. They entrusted the same declarations to the centurions and military tribunes, that through them they might be communicated to Caesar. Chapter 18. When the towers had now approached the walls, Caesar ascertained from the captives that Vercingetorix, after destroying the forage, had pitched his camp near Avaricum, and that he himself with the cavalry and light-armed infantry, who generally fought among the horse, had gone to lay an ambuscade in that quarter, to which he thought that our troops would come the next day to forage. On learning these facts, he set out from the camp secretly at midnight, and reached the camp of the enemy early in the morning. They, having quickly learned the arrival of Caesar by scouts, hid their cars and baggage in the thickest parts of the woods, and drew up all their forces in a lofty and open space, which circumstance being announced, Caesar immediately ordered the baggage to be piled, and the arms to be got ready. Chapter 19. There was a hill of a gentle ascent from the bottom, a dangerous and impassable marsh, not more than 50 feet broad, begirt it on almost every side. The Gauls, having broken down the bridges, posted themselves on this hill, in confidence of their position, and being drawn up in tribes according to their respective states, held all the fords and passages of that marsh with trusty guards, thus determined that if the Romans should attempt to force the marsh, they would overpower them from the higher ground while sticking in it, so that whoever saw the nearness of the position would imagine that the two armies were prepared to fight on almost equal terms. But whoever should view accurately the disadvantage of position would discover that they were showing off an empty affection of courage. Caesar clearly points out to his soldiers, who were indignant that the enemy could bear the sight of them at the distance of so short a space, and were earnestly demanding the signal for action, with how great loss and the death of how many gallant men the victory would necessarily be purchased. And when he saw them so determined to decline no danger for his renown, that he ought to be considered guilty of the utmost injustice if he did not hold their life dearer than his personal safety. Having thus consoled his soldiers, he leads them back on the same day to the camp, and determined to prepare the other things which were necessary for the siege of the town. Chapter 20. Vercingetorix, when he had returned to his men, was accused of treason, and that he had moved his camp nearer the Romans, and that he had gone away with all the cavalry, and that he had left so great forces without a commander, and that, on his departure, the Romans had come at such a favorable season, and with such dispatch, that all these circumstances could not have happened accidentally, or without design, that he preferred holding the sovereignty of Gaul by the grant of Caesar to acquiring it by their favor. Being accused in such a manner, he made the following reply to these charges: that his moving his camp had been caused by want of forage, and had been done even by their advice; that his approaching near the Romans had been a measure dictated by the favorable nature of the ground, which would defend him by its natural strength; that the service of the cavalry could not have been requisite in marshy ground, and was useful in that place to which they had gone; that he, on his departure, had given the supreme command to no one intentionally, lest he should be induced by the eagerness of the multitude to hazard an engagement, to which he perceived that all were inclined, owing to their want of energy, because they were unable to endure fatigue any longer; that, if the Romans in the meantime came up by chance, they, the Gauls, should feel grateful to fortune; if invited by the information of someone, they should feel grateful to him, because they were enabled to see distinctly from the higher ground the smallness of the number of their enemy, and despise the courage of those who, not daring to fight, retreated disgracefully into their camp. That he desired no power from Caesar by treachery, since he could have it by victory, which was now assured to himself and to all the Gauls, nay, that he would even give them back the command, if they thought that they conferred honor on him rather than receive safety from him. That you may be assured, said he, that I speak these words with truth. Listen to these Roman soldiers. He produces some camp followers, whom he had surprised on a foraging expedition some days before, and had tortured by famine and confinement. They, being previously instructed in what answers they should make when examined, say that they were legionary soldiers, that, urged by famine and want, they had recently gone forth from the camp, to see if they could find any corn or cattle in the fields, that the whole army was distressed by a similar scarcity, nor had any one now sufficient strength, nor could bear the labor of the work, and therefore that the general was determined, if he made no progress in the siege, to draw off his army in 3 days. These benefits, says Vercingetorix, you receive from me, whom you accuse of treason, me, by whose exertions you see so powerful and victorious an army almost destroyed by famine, without shedding one drop of your blood, and I have taken precautions that no state shall admit within its territories this army, and its ignominious flight from this place. Chapter 21. The whole multitude raise a shout and clash their arms, according to their custom, as they usually do in the case of him of whose speech they approve. They exclaim that Vercingetorix was a consummate general, and they had no doubt of his honor, that the war could not be conducted with greater prudence. They determined that 10,000 men should be picked out of the entire army and sent into the town, and decide that the general's safety should not be entrusted to the Bituriges alone, because they were aware that the glory of the victory must rest with the Bituriges, if they made good the defense of the town. Chapter 22. To the extraordinary valor of our soldiers, devices of every sort were opposed by the Gauls, since they are a nation of consummate ingenuity, and most skillful in imitating and making those things which are imparted by any one, for they turned aside the hooks with nooses, and when they had caught hold of them firmly, drew them on by means of engines, and undermined the mound the more skillfully on this account, because there are in their territories extensive iron mines, and consequently every description of mining operations is known and practiced by them. They had furnished, moreover, the whole wall on every side with turrets, and had covered them with skins. Besides, in their frequent sallies by day and night, they attempted either to set fire to the mound, or attack our soldiers when engaged in the works, and, moreover, by splicing the upright timbers of their own towers, they equaled the height of ours, as fast as the mound had daily raised them, and countermined our mines, and impeded the working of them by stakes bent and sharpened at the ends, and boiling pitch and stone of very great weight, and prevented them from approaching the walls. Chapter 23. But this is usually the form of all the Gallic walls. Straight beams, connected lengthwise and 2 feet distant from each other at equal intervals, are placed together on the ground. These are mortised on the inside, and covered with plenty of earth. But the intervals which we have mentioned are closed up in front by large stones. These being thus laid and cemented together, another row is added above, in such a manner that the same interval may be observed, and that the beams may not touch one another, but equal spaces intervening. Each row of beams is kept firmly in its place by a row of stones. In this manner, the whole wall is consolidated, until the regular height of the wall be completed. This work, with respect to appearance and variety, is not unsightly, owing to the alternate rows of beams and stones, which preserve their order in right lines, and, besides it, possesses great advantages as regards utility and the defense of cities, for the stone protects it from fire, and the wood from the battering ram, since it, the wood, being mortised in the inside with rows of beams, generally 40 feet each in length, can neither be broken through nor torn asunder. Chapter 24. The siege having impeded by so many disadvantages, the soldiers, although they were retarded during the whole time by the mud, cold, and constant showers, yet by their incessant labor overcame all these obstacles, and in 25 days raised a mound 330 feet broad and 80 feet high, when it almost touched the enemy's walls, and Caesar, according to his usual custom, kept watch at the work, and encouraged the soldiers not to discontinue the work for a moment. A little before the third watch they discovered that the mound was sinking, since the enemy had set it on fire by a mine, and at the same time a shout was raised along the entire wall, and a sally was made from 2 gates on each side of the turrets. Some at a distance were casting torches and dry wood from the wall on the mound, others were pouring on it pitch and other materials, by which the flame might be excited, so that a plan could hardly be formed as to where they should first run to the defense, or to what part aid should be brought. However, as 2 legions always kept guard before the camp by Caesar's orders, and several of them were at stated times at the work, measures were promptly taken that some should oppose the sallying party, others draw back the towers and make a cut in the rampart, and moreover, that the whole army should hasten from the camp to extinguish the flames. Chapter 25. When the battle was going on in every direction, the rest of the night being now spent, and fresh hopes of victory always arose before the enemy, the more so on this account, because they saw the coverings of our towers burnt away, and perceived that we, being exposed, could not easily go to give assistance, and they themselves were always relieving the weary with fresh men, and considered that all the safety of Gaul rested on this crisis. There happened in my own view a circumstance which, having appeared to be worthy of record, we thought it ought not to be omitted. A certain Gaul before the gate of the town, who was casting into the fire opposite the turret balls of tallow and fire, which were passed along to him, was pierced with a dart on the right side and fell dead. One of those next him stepped over him as he lay, and discharged the same office, when the second man was slain in the same manner by a wound from a crossbow. A third succeeded him, and a fourth succeeded the third, nor was this post left vacant by the besieged, until, the fire of the mound having been extinguished, and the enemy repulsed in every direction, an end was put to the fighting. Chapter 26. The Gauls, having tried every expedient, as nothing had succeeded, adopted the design of fleeing from the town the next day, by the advice and order of Vercingetorix. They hoped that, by attempting it at the dead of night, they would effect it without any great loss of men, because the camp of Vercingetorix was not far distant from the town, and the extensive marsh which intervened was likely to retard the Romans in the pursuit, and they were now preparing to execute this by night, when the matrons suddenly ran out into the streets, and weeping cast themselves at the feet of their husbands, and requested of them, with every entreaty, that they should not abandon themselves and their common children to the enemy for punishment, because the weakness of their nature and physical powers prevented them from taking to flight. When they saw that they, as fear does not generally admit of mercy in extreme danger, persisted in their resolution, they began to shout aloud and give intelligence of their fight to the Romans. The Gauls, being intimidated by fear of this, lest the passes should be preoccupied by the Roman cavalry, desisted from their design. Chapter 27. The next day Caesar, the tower being advanced, and the works, which he had determined to raise being arranged, a violent storm arising, thought this no bad time for executing his designs. because he observed the guards arranged on the walls a little too negligently, and therefore ordered his own men to engage in their work more remissly, and pointed out what he wished to be done. He drew up his soldiers in a secret position within the Vannae, and exhorts them to reap, at least, the harvest of victory proportionate to their exertions. He proposed a reward for those who should first scale the walls, and gave the signal to the soldiers. They suddenly flew out from all quarters, and quickly filled the walls. Chapter 28. The enemy being alarmed by the suddenness of the attack, were dislodged from the wall and towers, and drew up, in form of a wedge, in the marketplace and the open streets, with this intention that, if an attack should be made on any side, they should fight with their line drawn up to receive it. When they saw no one descending to the level ground, and the enemy extending themselves along the entire wall in every direction, fearing lest every hope of flight should be cut off, they cast away their arms and sought, without stopping, the most remote part of the town. A part was then slain by the infantry, when they were crowding upon one another in the narrow passage of the gates, and a part having got without the gates, were cut to pieces by the cavalry, nor was there one who was anxious for the plunder. Thus, being excited by the massacre at Genabum and the fatigue of the siege, they spared neither those worn out with years, women, or children. Finally, out of all that number, which amounted to about 40,000, scarcely 800, who fled from the town when they heard the first alarm, reached Vercingetorix in safety, and he, the night being now far spent, received them in silence after their flight, fearing that any sedition should arise in the camp from their entrance in a body, and the compassion of the soldiers, so that, having arranged his friends and the chiefs of the states at a distance on the road, he took precautions that they should be separated and conducted to their fellow countrymen, to whatever part of the camp had been assigned to each state from the beginning. Chapter 29. Vercingetorix, having convened an assembly on the following day, consoled and encouraged his soldiers in the following words: that they should be too much depressed in spirit, nor alarmed at their loss, that the Romans did not conquer by valor nor in the field, but by a kind of art and skill in assault, with which they themselves were unacquainted, that whoever expected every event in the war to be favorable erred, that it ever was his opinion that avaricum should be defended, of the truth of which statement he had themselves as witness, but that it was owing to the imprudence of the Bituriges, and the too ready compliance of the rest, that this loss was sustained, that, however, he would soon compensate it by superior advantages, for that he would, by his exertions, bring over those states which severed themselves from the rest of the Gauls, and would create a general unanimity throughout the whole of Gaul, the union of which not even the whole earth could withstand, and that he had it already almost effected, that in the meantime it was reasonable that he should prevail on them, for the sake of the general safety, to begin to fortify their camp, in order that they might the more easily sustain the sudden attacks of the enemy. Chapter 30. This speech was not disagreeable to the Gauls, principally because he himself was not disheartened by receiving so severe a loss, and had not concealed himself, nor shunned the eyes of the people, and he was believed to possess greater foresight and sounder judgment than the rest, because, when the affair was undecided, he had at first been of opinion that avaricum should be burnt, and afterward that it should be abandoned. Accordingly, as ill success weakens the authority of other generals, so, on the contrary, his dignity increased daily, although a loss was sustained. At the same time they began to entertain hopes, on his assertion, of uniting the rest of the states to themselves, and on this occasion, for the first time, the Gauls began to fortify their camps, and were so alarmed that although they were men unaccustomed to toil, yet they were of opinion that they ought to endure and suffer everything which should be imposed upon them. Chapter 31. Nor did Vercingetorix use less efforts than he had promised to gain over the other states, and, in consequence, endeavor to entice their leaders by gifts and promises. For this object he selected fitting emissaries, by whose subtle pleading or private friendship each of the nobles could be most easily influenced. He takes care that those who fled to him on the storming of Avaricum should be provided with arms and clothes, at the same time that his diminished forces should be recruited. He levies a fixed quota of soldiers from each state, and defines the number and day before which he should wish them brought to the camp, and orders all the archers, of whom there was a very great number in Gaul, to be collected and sent to him. By these means, the troops which were lost at Avaricum are speedily replaced. In the meantime, Tutomarus, the son of Olivacon, the king of the Netiobriges, whose father had received the appellation of friend from our senate, came to him with a great number of his own horse and those whom he had hired from Aquitania. Chapter 32. Caesar, after delaying several days at Avaricum, and finding there the greatest plenty of corn and other provisions, refreshed his army after their fatigue and privation. The winter being almost ended, when he was invited by the favorable season of the year to prosecute the war and march against the enemy, and try whether he could draw them from the marshes and woods, or else press them by a blockade. Some noblemen of the Audoi came to him as ambassadors to entreat that in an extreme emergency he should secure their state, that their affairs were in the utmost danger, because, whereas single magistrates had been usually appointed in ancient times and held the power of king for a single year, 2 persons now exercised this office, and each asserted that he was appointed according to their laws. That one of them was Convicto a powerful and illustrious youth, the others Cotus, sprung from a most ancient family, and personally a man of very great influence and extensive connections. His brother Valatekos had borne the same office during the last year. That the whole state was up in arms, the Senate divided, the people divided, that each of them had his own adherents, and that, if the animosity would be fomented any longer, the result would be that one part of the state would come to a collision with the other, that it rested with his activity and influence to prevent it. Chapter 33. Although Caesar considered it ruinous to leave the war and the enemy, yet, being well aware what great evils generally arise from internal dissensions, lest a state so powerful and so closely connected with the Roman people, which he himself had always fostered and honored in every respect, should have recourse to violence and arms, and that the party which had less confidence in its own power should summon aid from Vercingetorix, he determined to anticipate this movement. And because, by the laws of the Audoi, it was not permitted those who held the supreme authority to leave the country, he determined to go in person to the Audoi, lest he should appear to infringe upon their government and laws, and summoned all the Senate, and those between whom the dispute was, to meet him at Dessetia. When almost all the state had assembled there, and he was informed that one brother had been declared magistrate by the other, when only a few persons were privately summoned for the purpose, at a different time and place from what he ought, whereas the laws not only forbade 2 belonging to one family to be elected magistrates while each was alive, but even deterred them from being in the Senate. He compelled Cotus to resign his office. He ordered Convictio Latanus, who had been elected by the priest, according to the usage of the state, in the presence of the magistrates, to hold the supreme authority. Chapter 34. Having pronounced this decree between the contending parties, he exhorted the Aedui to bury in oblivion their disputes and dissensions, and, laying aside all these things, devote themselves to the war, and expect from him, on the conquest of Gaul, those rewards which they should have earned, and send speedily to him all their cavalry and 10,000 infantry, which he might place in different garrisons to protect his convoys of provisions, and then divided his army into 2 parts. He gave Labienus 4 legions to lead into the country of the Senones and Parcerici, and led in person 6 into the country of the Arverni, in the direction of the town of Gergovia, along the banks of the Alea. He gave part of the cavalry to Labienus, and kept part to himself. Vercingetorix, on learning this circumstance, broke down all the bridges over the river, and began to march on the other bank of the Alea. Chapter 35. When each army was in sight of the other, and was pitching their camp almost opposite that of the enemy, scouts being distributed in every quarter, lest the Romans should build a bridge and bring over their troops, it was to Caesar a matter attended with great difficulties, lest he should be hindered from passing the river during the greater part of the summer, as the Alea cannot generally be forded before the autumn. Therefore, that this might not happen, having pitched his camp in a woody place opposite to one of those bridges, which Vercingetorix had taken care should be broken down, the next day he stopped behind with 2 legions in a secret place. He sent on the rest of the forces as usual, with all the baggage, after having selected some cohorts. Then the number of the legions might appear to be complete. Having ordered these to advance as far as they could, when now, from the time of day, he conjectured they had come to an encampment, he began to rebuild the bridge on the same piles, the lower part of which remained entire. Having quickly finished the work and led his legions across, he selected a fit place for a camp, and recalled the rest of his troops. Vercingetorix, on ascertaining this fact, went before him by forced marches, in order that he might not be compelled to come to an action against his will. Chapter 36. Caesar, in 5 days' march, went from that place to Gergovia, and after engaging in a slight cavalry skirmish that day, on viewing the situation of the city, which, being built on a very high mountain, was very difficult of access, he despaired of taking it by storm, and determined to take no measures with regard to besieging it before he should secure a supply of provisions. But Vercingetorix, having pitched his camp on the mountain near the town, placed the forces of each state separately, and at small intervals around himself, and having occupied all the hills of that range as far as they commanded a view of the Roman encampment, he presented a formidable appearance. He ordered the rulers of the states, whom he had selected as his council of war, to come to him daily at the dawn, whether any measure seemed to require deliberation or execution. Nor did he allow almost any day to pass without testing in a cavalry action, the archers being intermixed, what spirit and valor there was in each of his own men. There was a hill opposite the town, at the very foot of that mountain, strongly fortified and precipitous on every side, which, if our men could gain, they seemed likely to exclude the enemy from a great share of their supply of water, and from free foraging. But this place was occupied by them with a weak garrison. However, Caesar set out from the camp in the silence of night, and dislodging the garrison before succor could come from the town, he got possession of the place and posted 2 legions there, and drew from the greater camp to the less a double trench 12 feet broad, so that the soldiers could even singly pass secure from any sudden attack of the enemy. Chapter 37. While these affairs were going on at Gergovia, Convictolenis, the Aeduan, to whom we have observed the magistracy was adjudged by Caesar, being bribed by the Averni, holds a conference with certain young men, the chief of whom were Letavicus and his brothers, who were born of a most noble family. He shares the bribe with them, and exhorts them to remember that they were free and born for empire, that the state of the Aedui was the only one which retarded the most certain victory of the Gauls, that the rest were held in check by its authority, and, if it was brought over, the Romans would not have room to stand on in Gaul, that he had received some kindness from Caesar, only so far, however, as gaining a most just cause by his decision, but that he assigned more weight to a general freedom. For why should the Aedui go to Caesar to decide concerning their rights and laws, rather than the Romans come to the Aedui? The young men, being easily won over by the speech of the magistrate and the bribe, when they declared that they would even be leaders in the plot. A plan for accomplishing it was considered, because they were confident their state could not be induced to undertake the war on slight grounds. It was resolved that Letavicus should have the command of the 10,000, which were being sent to Caesar for the war, and should have charge of them on their march, and that his brother should go before him to Caesar. They arranged the other measures, and the manner in which they should have them done. Chapter 38. Letavicus, having received the command of the army, suddenly convened the soldiers when he was about 30 miles distant from Gergovia, and, weeping, said, "Soldiers, whither are we going? All our knights and all their nobles have perished. Frédéric and Vercingetorix, the principal men of the state, being accused of treason, have been slain by the Romans without any permission to plead their cause. Learn this intelligence from those who have escaped from the massacre. For I, since my brothers and all my relations have been slain, am prevented by grief from declaring what has taken place. Persons are brought forward whom he had instructed in what he would have them say, and make the same statements to the soldiery as Letavicus had made. Then all the knights of the Aedui were slain, because they were said to have held conferences with the Averni, that they had concealed themselves among the multitude of soldiers, and had escaped from the midst of the slaughter. The Aedui shout aloud and conjure Letavicus to provide for their safety, as if, said he, it were a matter of deliberation, and not of necessity, for us to go to Gergovia and unite ourselves to the Averni, or have we any reasons to doubt that the Romans, after perpetrating the atrocious crime, are now hastening to slay us? Therefore, if there be any spirit in us, let us avenge the death of those who have perished in a most unworthy manner, and let us slay these robbers." He points to the Roman citizens who had accompanied them. In reliance on his protection, he immediately seizes a great quantity of corn and provisions, cruelly tortures them, and then puts them to death, sends messengers throughout the entire state of the Aedui, and rouses them completely by the same falsehood concerning the slaughter of their knights and nobles. He earnestly advises them to avenge, in the same manner as he did, the wrongs which they had received. Chapter 39. Frédéric the Aedouan, a young man born in the highest rank and possessing very great influence at home, and, along with Vercingetorix, of equal age and influence, but of inferior birth, whom Caesar had raised from a humble position to the highest rank, on being recommended to him by Dessin, had come in the number of horse. Being summoned by Caesar by name, these had a dispute with each other for precedence, and in the struggle between the magistrates they had contended with her utmost efforts, the one for convictor latanus, the other for cotis. Of these Frédéric, on learning the design of Litovicus, lays the matter before Caesar almost at midnight. He entreats that Caesar should not suffer their state to swerve from the alliance with the Roman people, owing to the depraved counsels of a few young men, which he foresaw would be the consequence if so many thousand men should unite themselves to the enemy, as their relations could not neglect their safety, nor the state regard it as a matter of slight importance. Chapter 40. Caesar felt great anxiety on this intelligence, because he had always especially indulged the state of the Audouai, and, without any hesitation, draws out from the camp 4 light-armed legions and all the cavalry, nor had he time, at such a crisis, to contract the camp, because the affair seemed to depend upon dispatch. He leaves Caius Fabius, his lieutenant, with 2 legions to guard the camp. When he ordered the brothers of Litovicus to be arrested, he discovers that they had fled a short time before to the camp of the enemy. He encouraged his soldiers not to be disheartened by the labor of the journey on such a necessary occasion, and, after advancing 25 miles, all being most eager, he came in sight of the army of the Audouai, and, by sending on his cavalry, retards and impedes their march. He then issues strict orders to all his soldiers to kill no one. He commands Frédéric and Vercingetorix, who they thought were killed, to move among the cavalry and address their friends. When they were recognized and the treachery of Litovicus discovered, the Audouai began to extend their hands to intimate submission, and, laying down their arms, to deprecate death. Litovicus, with his clansmen, who, after the custom of the Gauls, consider it a crime to desert their patrons, even in extreme misfortune, flees forth to Gergova. Chapter 41. Caesar, after sending messengers to the state of the Audouai to inform them that they whom he could have put to death by the right of war were spared through his kindness, and after giving 3 hours of the night to his army for his repose, directed his march to Gergova. Almost in the middle of the journey, a party of horse that were sent by Fabius stated in how great danger matters were. They informed him that the camp was attacked by a very powerful army, while fresh men were frequently relieving the wearied and exhausting our soldiers by the incessant toil, since on account of the size of the camp they had constantly to remain on the rampart, that many had been wounded by the immense number of arrows and all kinds of missiles, that the engines were of great service in withstanding them, that Fabius, at their departure, leaving only 2 gates open, was blocking up the rest, and was adding breastworks to the ramparts, and was preparing himself for a similar casualty on the following day. Caesar, after receiving this information, reached the camp before sunrise, owing to the very great zeal of his soldiers. Chapter 42. While these things were going on at Gergova, the Audouai, on receiving the first announcements from Litovicus, leave themselves no time to ascertain the truth of those statements. Some are stimulated by avarice, others by revenge and credulity, which is an innate propensity in that race of men to such a degree that they consider a slight rumor as an ascertained fact. They plunder the property of the Roman citizens, and either massacre them or drag them away to slavery. Convictor latanus increases the evil state of affairs, and goads on the people to fury, that by the commission of some outrage they may be ashamed to return to propriety. They entice from the town of Cabellonus, by a promise of safety, Marcus Aristius, a military tribune, who was on his march to his legion. They compelled those who had settled there for the purpose of trading to do the same. By constantly attacking them on their march, they stripped them of all their baggage. They besieged day and night those that resisted. When many were slain on both sides, they excite a great number to arms. Chapter 43. In the meantime, when intelligence was brought that all their soldiers were in Caesar's power, they run in a body to Aristius. They assure him that nothing had been done by public authority. They order an inquiry to be made about the plundered property. They confiscate the property of Lativicus and his brothers. They send ambassadors to Caesar for the purpose of clearing themselves. They do all this with a view to recover their soldiers, but being contaminated by guilt, and charmed by the gains arising from the plundered property, as that act was shared in by many, and being tempted by the fear of punishment, they began to form plans of war and stir up the other states by embassies. Although Caesar was aware of this proceeding, yet he addresses the ambassadors with as much mildness as he can, that he did not think worse of the state on account of the ignorance and fickleness of the mob, nor would diminish his regard for the Aedui. He himself, fearing a greater commotion in Gaul, in order to prevent his being surrounded by all the states, began to form plans as to the manner in which he should return from Gergovia, and again concentrate his forces, lest a departure arising from the fear of a revolt should seem like a flight. Chapter 44. While he was considering these things, an opportunity of acting successfully seemed to offer, for, when he had come into the smaller camp for the purpose of securing the works, he noticed that the hill in the possession of the enemy was stripped of men, although, on the former days, it could scarcely be seen on account of the numbers on it. Being astonished, he inquires the reason of it from the deserters, a great number of whom flocked to him daily. They all concurred in asserting, what Caesar himself had already ascertained by his scouts, that the back of that hill was almost level, but likewise woody and narrow, by which there was a pass to the other side of the town, that they had serious apprehensions for this place, and had no other idea on the occupation of one hill by the Romans than that, if they should lose the other, they would be almost surrounded and cut off from all egress and foraging, that they were all summoned by Vercingetorix to fortify this place. Chapter 45. Caesar, on being informed of this circumstance, sends several troops of horse to the place immediately after midnight. He orders them to range in every quarter with more tumult than usual. At dawn, he orders a large quantity of baggage to be drawn out of the camp, and the muleteers, with helmets, in the appearance and guise of horsemen, to ride round the hills. To these he adds a few cavalry, with instructions to range more widely to make a show. He orders them all to seek the same quarter by a long circuit. These proceedings were seen at a distance from the town, as Gergovia commanded a view of the camp. Nor could the Gauls ascertain at so great a distance what certainty there was in the maneuver. He sends one legion to the same hill, and after it had marched a little, stations it in the lower ground, and congeals it in the woods. The suspicion of the Gauls are increased, and all their forces are marched to that place to defend it. Caesar, having perceived the camp of the enemy deserted, covers the military insignia of his men, conceals the standards, and transfers his soldiers in small bodies from the greater to the less camp, and points out to the lieutenants, whom he had placed in command over the respective legions, what he should wish to be done. He particularly advises them to restrain their men from advancing too far, through their desire of fighting, or their hope of plunder. He sets before them what disadvantages the unfavorable nature of the ground carries with it, that they could be assisted by dispatch alone, that success depended on a surprise, and not on a battle. After stating these particulars, he gives the signal for action, and detaches the adouai at the same time by another ascent on the right. Chapter 46. The town wall was 1,200 paces distant from the plain, and foot of the ascent, in a straight line, if no gap intervened. Whatever circuit was added to this ascent, to make the hill easy, increased the length of the route. But almost in the middle of the hill, the Gauls had previously built a wall 6 feet high, made of large stones, and extending in length as far as the nature of the ground permitted, as a barrier to retard the advance of our men, and leaving all the lower space empty. They had filled the upper part of the hill, as far as the wall of the town, with their camps very close to one another. The soldiers, on the signal being given, quickly advanced to this fortification, and passing over it, make themselves masters of the separate camps. And so great was their activity in taking the camps, that Teutomarus, the king of the Nitiobriges, being suddenly surprised in his tent, as he had gone to rest at noon, with difficulty escaped from the hands of the plunderers, with the upper part of his person naked, and his horse wounded. Chapter 47. Caesar, having accomplished the object which he had in view, ordered the signal to be sounded for a retreat, and the soldiers of the 10th Legion, by which he was then accompanied, halted. But the soldiers of the other legions, not hearing the sound of the trumpet, because there was a very large valley between them, were however kept back by the tribunes of the soldiers and the lieutenants, according to Caesar's orders, but being animated by the prospect of speedy victory, and the flight of the enemy, and the favorable battles of former periods, they thought nothing so difficult that their bravery could not accomplish it. Nor did they put an end to the pursuit, until they drew nigh to the wall of the town and the gates. But then, when a shout arose in every quarter of the city, those who were at a distance, being alarmed by the sudden tumult, fled hastily from the town, since they thought that the enemy were within the gates. The matrons begin to cast their clothes in silver over the wall, and bending over as far as the lower part of the bosom, with outstretched hands beseech the Romans to spare them, and not to sacrifice their resentment, even women and children, as they had done at Avaricum. Some of them let themselves down from the walls by their hands, and surrendered to our soldiers. Lucius Fabius, a centurion of the 8th Legion, who, it was ascertained, had said that day among his fellow soldiers that he was excited by the plunder of Avaricum, and would not allow any one to mount the wall before him, finding 3 men of his own company, and being raised up by them, scaled the wall. He himself, in turn, taking hold of them one by one, drew them up to the wall. Chapter 48. In the meantime, those who had gone to the other part of the town to defend it, as we have mentioned above, at first, aroused by hearing the shouts, and afterward, by frequent accounts, that the town was in possession of the Romans, sent for the cavalry, and hastened in larger numbers to that quarter. As each first came, he stood beneath the wall, and increased the number of his countrymen engaged in action. When a great multitude of them had assembled, the matrons, who a little before were stretching their hands from the walls to the Romans, began to beseech their countrymen, and after the Gallic fashion to show their dishevelled hair, and bring their children into public view. Neither in position nor in numbers was the contest an equal one to the Romans. At the same time, being exhausted by running and the long continuation of the fight, they could not easily withstand fresh and vigorous troops. Chapter 49. Caesar, when he perceived that his soldiers were fighting on unfavorable ground, and that the enemy's forces were increasing, being alarmed for the safety of his troops, sent orders to Titus Sextius, one of his lieutenants, whom he had left to guard the smaller camp, to lead out his cohorts, quickly from the camp, and post them at the foot of the hill, on the right wing of the enemy, that, if he should see our men driven from the ground, he should deter the enemy from following too closely. He himself, advancing with the legion a little from that place where he had taken his post, awaited the issue of the battle. Chapter 50. While the fight was going on most vigorously, hand to hand, and the enemy depended on the position and numbers, our men on their bravery, the Ardois suddenly appeared on our exposed flank, as Caesar had sent them by another ascent on the right, for the sake of creating a diversion. These, from the similarity of their arms, greatly terrified our men, and although they were discovered to have their right shoulders bare, which was usually the sign of those reduced to peace, yet the soldiers suspected that this very thing was done by the enemy to deceive them. At the same time, Lucius Fabius, the centurion, and those who had scaled the wall with him, being surrounded and slain, were cast from the wall. Marcus Petrius, a centurion of the same legion, after attempting to hew down the gates, was overpowered by numbers, and, despairing of his safety, having already received many wounds, said to the soldiers of his own company who followed him, "Since I cannot save you as well as myself, I shall at least provide for your safety, since I, allured by the love of glory, led you into this danger. Do you save yourselves when an opportunity is given." At the same time he rushed into the midst of the enemy, and slaying 2 of them, drove back the rest a little from the gate. When his men attempted to aid him, in vain, he says, "You endeavor to procure me safety, since blood and strength are now failing me. Therefore leave this, while you have the opportunity, and retreat to the legion." Thus he fell fighting a few moments after, and saved his men by his own death. Chapter 51. Our soldiers, being hard-pressed on every side, were dislodged from their position with the loss of 46 centurions, but the 10th Legion, which had been posted in reserve on ground a little more level, checked the Gauls in their eager pursuit. It was supported by the cohorts of the 13th Legion, which, being led from the smaller camp, had, under the command of Titus Sextius, occupied the higher ground. The legions, as soon as they reached the plain, halted and faced the enemy. Vercingetorix led back his men from the part of the hill within the fortifications. On that day, little less than 700 of the soldiers were missing. Chapter 52. On the next day, Caesar, having called a meeting, censured the ravishness and avarice of his soldiers, and that they had judged for themselves how far they ought to proceed, or what they ought to do, and could not be kept back by the tribunes of the soldiers and the lieutenants, and stated what the disadvantage of the ground could effect, what opinion he himself had entertained at Avaricum, when, having surprised the enemy without either general or cavalry, he had given up a certain victory, lest even a trifling loss should occur in the contest owing to the disadvantage of position, that as much as he admired the greatness of their courage, since neither the fortifications of the camp, nor the height of the mountain, nor the wall of the town could retard them, in the same degree he censured their licentiousness and arrogance, because they thought that they knew more than their general concerning victory and the issue of actions, and that he required in his soldiers forbearance and self-command, not less than valor and magnanimity. Chapter 53. Having held this assembly, and having encouraged the soldiers at the conclusion of his speech, that they should not be dispirited on this account, nor attribute to the valor of the enemy what the disadvantage of position had caused. Entertaining the same views of his departure that he had previously had, he led forth the legions from the camp, and drew up his army in order of battle in a suitable place, when Vercingetorix, nevertheless, would not descend to the level ground, a slight cavalry action, and that a successful one. Having taken place, he led back his army into the camp. When he had done this, the next day, thinking that he had done enough to lower the pride of the Gauls, and to encourage the minds of his soldiers, he moved his camp in the direction of the Audouai. The enemy not even then pursuing us, on the third day he repaired the bridge over the river Allier, and led over his whole army. Chapter 54. Having then held an interview with Vercingetorix and Aporodorix, the Audouans, he learns that Litavicus had set out with all the cavalry to raise the Audouai, that it was necessary that they too should go before him to confirm the state in their allegiance. Although he now saw distinctly the treachery of the Audouai in many things, and was of opinion that the revolt of the entire state would be hastened by their departure, yet he thought that they should not be detained, lest he should appear either to offer an insult or betray some suspicion of fear. He briefly states to them when departing his services towards the Audouai, in what a state and how humbled he had found them, driven into their towns, deprived of their lands, stripped of all their forces, a tribute imposed on them, and hostages wrested from them with the utmost insult, and to what condition and to what greatness he had raised them, so much so that they had not only recovered their former position, but seemed to surpass the dignity and influence of all the previous eras of their history. After giving these admonitions, he dismissed them. Chapter 55. Noviodunum was a town of the Audouai, advantageously situated on the banks of the Lori. Caesar had conveyed hither all the hostages of Gaul, the corn, public money, a great part of his own baggage, and that of his army. He had sent hither a great number of horses, which he had purchased in Italy and Spain on account of this war. When Aporodorix and Vercingetorix came to this place, and received information of the disposition of the state, that Litavicus had been admitted by the Audouai into Babracti, which is a town of the greatest importance among them, that Convictio Latanus, the chief magistrate, and a great part of the Senate had gone to meet him, that ambassadors had been publicly sent to Vercingetorix to negotiate a peace and alliance. They thought that so great an opportunity ought not to be neglected. Therefore, having put to the sword the garrison of Noviodunum, and those who had assembled there for the purpose of trading, or were on their march, they divided the money and horses among themselves. They took care that the hostages of the different states should be brought to Babracti. To the chief magistrate, they burned the town to prevent its being of any service to the Romans, as they were of opinion that they could not hold it. They carried away in their vessels whatever corn they could in the hurry. They destroyed the remainder by throwing it into the river or setting it on fire. They themselves began to collect forces from the neighboring country, to place guards and garrisons in different positions along the banks of the Lori, and to display the cavalry on all sides to strike terror into the Romans, to try if they could cut them off from a supply of provisions, in which expectation they were much aided, from the circumstance that the Lori had swollen to such a degree from the melting of the snows that it did not seem capable of being forded at all. Chapter 56. Caesar, on being informed of these movements, was of opinion that he ought to make haste, even if he should run some risk in completing the bridges, in order that he might engage before greater forces of the enemy should be collected in that place. For no one even then considered it an absolute necessary act, that changing his design he should direct his march into the province, both because the infamy and disgrace of the thing, and the intervening Mount Cevennes, and the difficulty of the roads prevented him, and especially because he had serious apprehensions for the safety of Labienus, whom he had detached, and those legions whom he had sent with him. Therefore, having made very long marches by day and night, he came to the river Lore, contrary to the expectation of all, and having by means of the cavalry found out a ford, suitable enough considering the emergency, of such depth that their arms and shoulders could be above water for supporting their accoutrements. He dispersed his cavalry in such a manner as to break the force of the current, and having confounded the enemy at the first sight, led his army across the river in safety, and finding corn and cattle in the fields, after refreshing his army with them, he determined to march into the country of the Sonones. Chapter 57. While these things are being done by Caesar, Labienus, leaving at Agendicum the recruits who had lately arrived from Italy to guard the baggage, marches with 4 legions to Lututia, which is a town of the Parisii, situated on an island on the river Seine, whose arrival being discovered by the enemy, numerous forces arrive from the neighboring states. The supreme command is entrusted to Camulganus, one of the Alarchi, who, although almost worn out with age, was called to that honor on account of his extraordinary knowledge of military tactics. He, when he observed that there was a large marsh, which communicated with the Seine, and rendered all that country impassable, encamped there, and determined to prevent our troops from passing it. Chapter 58. Labienus at first attempted to raise Venae, fill up the marsh with hurdles and clay, and secure a road. After he perceived that this was too difficult to accomplish, he issued in silence from his camp at the 3rd watch, and reached Melodunum by the same route by which he came. This is a town of the Sonones, situated on an island in the Seine, as we have just before observed a Lututia. Having seized upon about 50 ships, and quickly joined them together, and having placed soldiers in them, he intimidated by his unexpected arrival the inhabitants, of whom a great number had been called out to the war, and obtains possession of the town without a contest. Having repaired the bridge, which the enemy had broken down during the preceding days, he led over his army, and began to march along the banks of the river to Lututia. The enemy, on learning the circumstance from those who had escaped from Melodunum, set fire to Lututia, and orders the bridges of that town to be broken down. They themselves set out from the marsh, and take their position on the banks of the Seine, over against Lututia, and opposite the camp of the Labienus. Chapter 59. Caesar was now reported to have departed from Gergovia. Intelligence was likewise brought to them concerning the revolt of the Aedui, and a successful rising in Gaul, and that Caesar, having been prevented from prosecuting his journey and crossing the Lore, and having been compelled by the want of corn, had marched hastily to the province. But the Bellovaci, who had been previously disaffected of themselves on learning the revolt of the Aedui, began to assemble forces and openly to prepare for war. Then Labienus, as the change in affairs was so great, thought that he must adopt a very different system from what he had previously intended, and he did not now think of making any new acquisitions, or of provoking the enemy to an action, but that he might bring back his army safe to Agendicum. For, on one side, the Bellovaci, a state which held the highest reputation for prowess in Gaul, were pressing on him, and Camulganus, with a disciplined and well-equipped army, held the other side. Moreover, a very great river separated and cut off the legions from the garrison and baggage. He saw that, in consequence of such great difficulties being thrown in his way, he must seek aid from his own energy of disposition.